The following is a presentation of the Mat Talk Podcast Network.
It's time to attack. With the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast. Here on the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast, you'll find youth and high school coaching tips for coaches, parents, and wrestlers, featuring Gable-trained NCAA champion and Hall of Fame high school coach Daryl Weber. Also featured is a monthly dialogue with legendary wrestling coach Dan Gable. Find out more on AttackStyleWrestling.com. Now, on to the show. And welcome back to the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant and Daryl Weber here as we finish up our four-part series on the anatomy of a perfect practice plan. And to recap, if you're just joining us, stop, collaborate and listen, go back to part 1 and listen, or else I will sing more Vanilla Ice. You don't want that. Daryl knows I can do some karaoke, but you don't necessarily want that on a wrestling podcast. But part 1, we talked about the warm-up and the pre-practice speech. Part 2, we went into quick drills and technique. Part 3, we went into live control battles and live wrestling. Now we're going to wrap things up here on part 4 with the conditioning and strength, the cool down, the post-match practice, and wrapping up the series with the conclusion of this 4-part series. Again, the anatomy of a perfect practice plan, the cheat sheet available at attackstylewrestling.com. Coach Weber, we've gone through so much about this world of coaching and the world of teaching in this 4-part series in the first 3 parts. Now we get into something that you're really known for, and that is your strength, because you didn't get the name Weber Grill because you're named after a piece of outdoor cookware. You got the name because Dan Gable goes, "Oh, Weber Grill, that's tough." It's based on your strength and toughness. So we're going to talk about conditioning and strength. But before we get into that, let's talk about this, the nickname I just threw at you. You were known as the Weber Grill. Weber's a grill company for those who don't know, but I just want to hear that little snippet of a Gable story on how you got that name.
Oh yeah, that was my first year at Iowa, and I was in the weight room just lifting. I think I was by myself. It wasn't a coach putting me through, and I was just pumping some iron. And Gable was over there working out as well. And yeah, he just kind of came out of. I think he might have went to get a drink or something. And then all of a sudden he came around there's like a little half wall that separates the wrestling room and the weight room at Iowa. And I think he came back into the room, just spouting that off. Weber Grill, 25,000 BTUs, something like that. And turn the heat up. So he was just trying to get me fired up. When you're a freshman, he probably seen me getting my tail whooped for months on end and was trying to get me excited and get me fired up. And it did. He was a master of pushing the buttons that you need pushed. So it kind of stuck with me. It stuck with me for a long time. Not too many people call me Weber Grill anymore, but they did through college and shortly after.
Yeah, and anybody with your old Yahoo email address as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Daryl told me that story for the first time. We were on a plane to Battle Creek, Michigan in 2001 for the Scholastic Duels, which is now currently held, I believe, in Pennsylvania and New York. But that was just a killer event where that was interesting as part of Team Virginia. It was myself as the media guy, Coach Weber, Coach Jamie Kelly, who was at the time at Cox High School, and Coach Teddy Evans, who was at the time, I think he was at Tallwood or at Hickory. I'm not quite sure where he was at. But yeah, that was a great trip, and that's where I first met Coach Weber, and it's hard to believe it's been 15 years since that time you got stuck on a plane next to me for 2.5 hours just talking to your ear up. Be like, "Hey, you're a national champ, huh? Where you at? What are you doing?"
Yep, that's where I met all you. That's where I was indoctrinated to all those crazy Virginia coaches and media guys.
That was an interesting crew, to say the least. But
it was fun.
Yeah, because you needed the strength and conditioning to keep up with that particular realm of travel, because we had to fly to Chicago, then drive to Battle Creek. And yeah, anyway, that's a story for another podcast. But moving into the conditioning and strength, we've gone through the live goes. Now, conditioning and strength, and this is something that doesn't always happen in the practice room in the 2-3 hours you've got allotted. Sometimes it's preseason weight training, or it's before school weight training, or various things from other sports. But when you talk about conditioning and strength, it's not just like lift bar heavy, me strong. Wrestling brings a different type of conditioning and strength to the table.
Yeah, definitely. And in high school wrestling, during the season, those kids got to go to school all day long. So it's hard to, it's sometimes hard to get a lot of it, to get your whole team to come in the morning and lift weights and then go to school all day and then go get practice. And, I tried to do that, and there's certain athletes that would do that and they were fine. But, when it came to the bulk of your athletes, typically it wasn't the best regimen a lot of times. So I would try to get my strength training in at practice in some fashion. So yeah, when you go, towards the end of practice and you're looking to do your strength and conditioning, you got to kind of know what you want to accomplish. And, kind of a standard template. Mondays, a lot of times we would come in and instead of doing a bunch of sprints and stuff like that, we would go in and do a little kind of a heavier lift, working on your strength. And then maybe later in the week on a Wednesday or Thursday, we would incorporate a circuit type lift in there with a lot of body weight stuff or kettlebells and things like that. And you would incorporate that would be your conditioning, and you're working your strength as well. But then a lot of times, when you're talking just pure conditioning at a wrestling practice, one of the favorite things one of the best tools I could use was kind of like the quick drills, like we talked about towards the beginning of practice after warm up. I loved after live wrestling, and Coach Gable used to kind of do this, and he would call it execution. You get just two guys, two wrestlers. And what I like to do is start to put them through drills. Okay, we're going to go, we have different drills. Like we have one that we call the bad drill. We have one called the Fury bad drill. We have the demon drill. I got a bunch of different names for these different high intensity drills that we would do at the end of practice. And there was rules for each of these drills, and they all knew the rules. And if they broke the rules, I wouldn't count the time a lot of times. So let's say we're going to do the bad drill. And first guy's going to do the bad drill for a minute. The other guy's going to do the bad drill for a minute. But if I don't see X, Y, Z, these rules that I have put in place, that minute doesn't count. And what that does is obviously it gets really good conditioning, but it teaches focus. And if you watch high school wrestling, youth wrestling, so many matches are lost because kids can't focus, especially when they're tired. So they know these techniques, they know how to do certain things, but if you get a little bit tired, you get towards the end of a match, they don't sprawl properly, or they don't do the basic things properly just because they don't focus. So I would love to use these kind of execution or quick drills that I created at the end of practice they build incredible conditioning and mental strength, but they build focus and they build toughness. And you'll have your kids that will just they'll struggle with them. They'll struggle with these little things that they have to do. But once it clicks, man, it crosses over to live wrestling very, very well. So we would do a lot of those type of scenarios. And then in the standard practice, at the end of a standard practice, you go into your different practice drills, and they would focus on, basic elements that you have to be good at to win big matches that work at all levels. And then you would go into there's a lot of different ways that you can condition. Maybe you do stance and motion type stuff, and where they're having to stay in their stance and hit good sprawls, explosive sprawls and shots and things like that. You might do that for, a period or a match length or maybe just a period. There's, put them on the wall and have them do sprints. And this is something, when you get into this type of stuff, it's really important to kind of know how to peak your athletes. Like you can't just bury your athletes, take them over the edge every single day. They're going to start getting injured. They're going to get burnt out. You're going to fry them. They're not going to be fresh for competition. So, usually if you looked at a standard week when I was head coach, you would probably come in Monday. We would do our kind of a regular practice routine. And at the end, we would go lift heavy. And Tuesday, Wednesday-ish, is where we got where we grew mental toughness wise. You took them, you pushed them at the end. We did our technique, we did our live wrestling, and maybe one day is harder than the other between Monday and Tuesday. And then maybe a Thursday is where we go in and we do our, kind of our circuit training, or a little bit more lifting. And then your Friday, you're tapering before a tournament, something like that. But usually I would pick a Monday or Tuesday, or a Tuesday or Wednesday. And a lot of times at the end, we might take them in the halls. In the school, we would take them up in the halls. They would do sprints in the halls. And I would always, at the beginning of the year, I would always build some kind of weekly peaking strategy for the amount that they're going to run in halls. And then usually it would start with longer runs, and then and then build into shorter sprints, more explosive sprints. And, I always liked, like Coach Gable talks about, he talks about how much he lied to his team. And he says that jokingly, but it's a very valuable teaching tool. So when we're doing conditioning, maybe you're doing sprints or whatever, where you're pushing them, and you say, okay, we got three more and you're done. And you do your 3 and you say, okay, let's do one more. And that's what Coach Gable's talking about lying. Or you're doing a 5-minute wrestle go and you do more.
Yeah,
but
it's not like a 10-mile run and he drops you off 15 miles away.
Yeah. You're doing these sprints, and what I get my guys to understand is we've pushed them. They're at this. We're talking about our high school team. These are high level athletes. We've pushed them. They think they're done. They've thrown everything out there. Okay, we got 3 more. They do that third one. I go, all right, let's do one more. If they look at me sideways, if they pout or complain, I'm going to point out to them, what are you going to do when the referee makes a bad call at the end of the match? You going to pout? You going to complain? You going to give up? So I tell them they got to have a stone cold poker face no matter what I tell them to do. And so when they get in a match and things aren't going right, they get taken down right away. They're in overtime and, or maybe they're winning the whole match and the guy hits a reversal right at the end and ties it up. Are you going to start pouting and crying? No, you got to know how to deal with that adversity. You got to know how to, shut everything down and just keep going. So that was a very, Coach Gable talks about lying to the team, but that's a very valuable tool to build mental toughness and teach guys how to win the tough matches, the overtime matches, the close matches that really matter.
As we've wrapped up practice, now we've got the practice plan as we're going through the anatomy of it. Conditioning and strength is usually the last thing, but it's not the last thing because the cool down is a super important part of this. So again, preventing injuries, that's part of that, what we talked about in part 1 about what actually is a perfect practice. Well, keeping injuries out of it, of course, they're unavoidable, but a cool down is a key component to making sure your athletes stay healthy.
Yeah, I always like to use this time. So you're done, all the hard stuff is over, and, you usually, slow it down, I would usually have them start jogging maybe around the outside of the practice room, just a light jog, or some static stretching, something like that. But this is where I'm talking. This is where I'm getting in their ear about, what's coming up. Maybe we got a tough team. Maybe we got a big tournament coming up. Maybe this team thinks they're going to beat us. And I'm getting in their heads right now. Maybe a couple of them had a really bad practice, and I could tell they're on the verge of cracking, and I start pumping them up and telling them, hey, you're doing the right things. And this is where you got to get in their head. And at the end of practice, so you want to make sure, and then you can do this to the team as a group, make them feel good about all that work they just put in, because there's, a lot of them, their guts are hurting, and make them feel proud of what they did. And then some of them, just, you got to know your athletes. Some of them you might want, you break it down at the end of practice. Some you might grab individually and just talk to them, and pump them up, or, give them some specific advice on what you saw at practice. But you got to use that end, kind of the wind down period. And then, you always try to coach your kids to stay after and do a little bit extra. That's where the studs are always staying after and, doing some extra running or drilling or live wrestling, something like that. So usually coaches are milling around helping out guys at the end, but that cool down and post practice, I call it the post practice speech, is a really important part of practice, I think. I think you can really make a big difference on how practice ends and the vibe that each of the kids have going out of that practice room if you use that properly. And like I said, I think a real big part of it is just a lot of times just making them feel invincible, like they just did more than anybody else is doing, and making them feel proud of that work that they just put in, if they're doing good work.
And what other things do you say in this post-practice speech? As you said, you say you pump them up, you make them feel good, you point out things, but there are so many other intangibles. I mean, you've got to make sure that they're aware of tests, especially if we're dealing with high school kids. Okay, stay on top of your grades. Make sure, there's simple things that we need to also reinforce with our athletes and making sure that they are, it kind of goes without saying, but we need to sometimes reinforce the fact that they need to be good citizens. They need to be respectful of their teachers and other coaches and things of that nature. And this is also a time where their bodies and minds might be broken down a little bit, but this is also where they could absorb the most, because a lot of them are looking up at you going like, I'll listen to anything you say right now, coach, anything you say.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This is a good time to talk about logistics. If when we're leaving for trips, tests are coming up, making sure, if there's an issue, if there's an issue with tardies or something like that. Like I said before, you got to always have your ears open about, what's going on outside the practice room with your guys. So yeah, you talk about those things as well. You talk about the character building and the life lesson components of your program that you want to get across to them. You're always working those things in there. But the main thing is, yeah, you work those components in, but you use that time. Like you said, they're listening. And if you make them, they'll soak up a lot right at that time. And a lot of times people don't use that time. They just kind of, all right, we're done. See ya. I always make it a routine at the beginning of practice to be saying something, and at the end of practice to be saying something.
Now, as we come up to a conclusion of this 4-part series, there are 3 points that we want to drive home here at the end. We're going to talk about the variations of peaking, the length of practices, and the length of each segment that we had described above in the first 3 episodes. So, Coach Weber, the variations for peaking, when we close up this segment, what do you mean by that particular phrase?
Yeah, I mean, just in a real broad stroke, what we've gone over, is just kind of the main format of just a standard practice. And that's going to change as the season progresses. You might have your technique, your practice might be more technique at the beginning of practice or at the beginning of the season, where you're making sure everybody knows the proper techniques, and then you kind of slide to more drills and live wrestling. And in mid-season, you're really pushing them and getting that conditioning, to that next level. And then that last part of season, practice might be shortening up. You're really not teaching a lot of new stuff. It's just a lot of drills, a lot of individual focus on what individuals need, and maybe shorter live wrestling to keep injuries down and intensity up. So there's these different. I'm going to go over kind of the standard maybe length of each of these segments, but they're going to kind of shift for peaking purposes throughout the year. And at the beginning of the season, your some practices might go 2.5 hours just because there's so much teaching going on, and they're not, maybe the intensity level isn't quite as high. And then you might go I would say the average practice during the season is about 2 hours for what we used to do. But then towards the end, the last month or so, 60 minutes was a lot of times all we would go in for. You'd go in, you'd warm up, you'd go through your drills, and a lot of times there, the drilling becomes more independent, where you're, rather than saying, okay, we're going to do high crotch, this setup, this finish, you're just saying, all right, let's work your best stuff in the neutral position, and each guy's going, and you're just walking, the coaches are walking around working individually on finer points. And then you get into your live wrestling, and it's a lot of, short time goes and scenarios like that, where you're getting them to score a lot of points. And you're, like I said, you're keeping the live down a little bit to keep the injuries down and the intensity up. So it varies a little bit, but typically, in a standard 2-hour practice, you're gonna talk to them probably 10 minutes. You're gonna go through, and this is all on my cheat sheet. You're gonna go through your warm up is gonna be maybe 20 minutes. Your quick drill is about 15. Technique 35 minutes, and then your live wrestling might be in the time by the time you're wrestling, taking your breaks, doing all that, 30 minutes, and then a 10-minute conditioner. That might be the standard time frames of each segment of a practice.
Again, we can get the entire cheat sheet here at attackstylewrestling.com. Again, the anatomy of a perfect practice plan. And you heard Coach Weber talk about Coach Dan Gable's independent and dependent practices. You can go back and listen to those on episodes 14 and 15 here on attackstylewrestling.com. Or if you subscribe to this show, you can go back through your podcast, podcatcher, podcast RSS reader, whatever you want to call it, and go back and listen to episodes 14 and 15 with Coach Gable, as that was such a great breakdown. We had to say, you know what, this is too good to leave in one spot. So we've got 2 of them there for you with Coach Gable. And Coach Weber, as we wrap up this series, I've learned a lot, and I have no intention of ever being a wrestling coach. Granted, I do hold a coach's card on the chance that a buddy asked me to sit in his corner at the World Team Trials, which has happened. But from a layman's perspective, in terms of, I don't have the wrestling acumen and coaching ability and knowledge that you do, but this has come through as extremely understandable for somebody who, if I get the wild hair of going down across the street, I want to help coach, which will never happen. But the understanding of, okay, I've got a good model to follow. So, and then you've got the high school coaches that always learn. I mean, we don't learn, we borrow and steal. That's called coaching, right? So all of these tips that have come together in this 4-part series, one, I think it's from where I sit, I'm understanding how my coach used to structure practice, because I saw a lot of the same things that you're explaining here. I go back and look at it, and, revisionist history, I did a lot better than I thought I did. But we see where this is how it's structured, and the successful programs. And we had a successful program, and we had state champions. We had guys wrestle Division I. We had a good team, and it was the structure of the program was very similar to these techniques that you taught. So the proof is in the pudding. I've seen it, and coaches around the country have seen it. Your wrestlers have seen it. So, Coach, final thoughts as we wrap up this 4-part series. Again, the anatomy of a perfect practice plan.
Yeah, I mean, you got to take this stuff serious and kind of get a good game plan, because this is where you have the chance to make the biggest impact. So you want to make sure you can cram as much into the 2 hours or whatever your practice is going to be. And we're not talking about just learning single legs. We're talking about building that mind, building character, and like I said at the very beginning, not everybody's going to have a state championship team, but everybody can use those 2 hours. Every coach can use those 2 hours to teach those life lessons, to make these athletes better prepared as they leave high school and move on, to just be better citizens and understand how to deal with adversity and how to work hard, and all those great American values that wrestling teaches. And I'm glad to hear you say that this is all very understandable, because that's my goal with Attack Style Wrestling, with Gable Trained, our members area, is to take the things that, like you said too, I didn't invent this stuff. I learned it, fine-tuned it over the years, with a lot of practice, a lot of dedication. And I want to pass this on to as many people. I want to have as big as impact as I possibly can in wrestling. And I feel like by taking the lessons I learned from people like Dan Mashik, Dan Gable, Kevin Dresser, myself in the trenches for a decade and a half, teaching youth and high school wrestlers, and make it understandable, present it to people so that they can use it and take it to their programs and influence, the kids in their programs for years and years to come. And, in our Gable Trained members area, we have ton of tools on practices. We actually have where I break down, we call it the standards of learning, where we have a level 1, level 2. It's kind of like a martial arts system, and it takes the techniques and the skills that the beginners should know, and it breaks them down into actual practices. Each segment, like we're talking about, a practice is broken down into a short video where I describe the talk that that you would give at practice. We go through the warm-ups, we go through quick drills, techniques to be taught, live wrestling scenarios, conditioning. All of that stuff is broken down into actual practice plans. You can pull up on your computer or your phone, and you can pull from it. You could, if you're a head coach, you can scale it out, give it to your youth, and say, hey, here's the practices, here's the techniques I want you guys to learn, because that's going to feed the guys up into middle school and high school and make sure they're learning the things that we're teaching up here. So, like I said, I'm glad to hear that you thought it was very understandable, because that's the whole goal, is to kind of pass on as much knowledge as I possibly can and help out as many programs and wrestlers as possible.
And that'll again wrap up our 4-part series on the anatomy of a perfect practice plan. For Coach Darrell Weber, my name is Jason Bryant. Be sure to rate and review this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and find out all the products that you can find, as Coach Weber just mentioned, at attackstylewrestling.com.
Show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.